Iowa City is a unique community. This uniqueness is shaped by the people who have contributed their time, their energy, and their ideas to Iowa City and the university. Welcome to a series of biographical interviews of special women and men who have affected this community. Their contributions have been valuable, their lives creative and full. What brought them here? Who influenced them? What contributions are they the most pleased about? These and other questions will be explored during this series of interviews entitled, Tell Me Your Story. The story you will hear today is that of Marion L. Huit, who has been involved in varied and challenging vocations over the years. He has been a teacher in China, he has worked in advertising, he was an FBI agent, and associated with students for 3 decades. He came to the University of Iowa in 1946 as Assistant Director for the Office of Student Affairs. The following year, the position was named Consular to Men. He remained in that role until 1956 when he became Dean of Students. Dean Huit retired in 1978 after a 32-year association with the university. He was a witness to student apathy and student activism. In his role as dean, he served as mediator, a release valve, a listener, a counselor, an ombudsman. During his long tenure with the university, Dean Huit also contributed to the Iowa City community. He's been a university hospital volunteer. He served on the Public Library's Long-Range Planning Committee. He's a member of Rotary and is currently on the board of directors of the Foreign Relations Council and the Council of International Visitors to Iowa City, otherwise known as civic. He and his wife Jane have 3 children, Sarah, Nancy, and Marion. Welcome to Tell Me Your Story, Dean Huit.
Thank you.
You graduated from Ohio Wesleyan in 1933. Are you a Ohio native?
Yes, I was born in Delta, Ohio, of parents whose father was an immigrant from Germany, 1940 or 1848, the year that many immigrants came over to the United States. And the name was originally Huit, H-U-I-T-H. But my grandfather, I think, may have been a draft dodger. He decapitated the H, and it became Huit, so that many people pronounce our name Huit or Wheat in French.
In French,
but
right? But you're really German.
It's actually German, Bavarian.
When you graduated from Ohio Wesleyan, did you immediately go take a job in China?
Yes. Tell
us about that period. You were teaching in a high school for students of were they American students?
American students. I had the opportunity of going to China right after graduation, and the opportunity came because a woman from Indiana turned down the job. I've been forever grateful to that woman. But the school was primarily for Americans, but there were many Chinese and other nationalities in the school. There were about, I would say, 100 in the upper classes. I taught English and ancient history. I'd had no ancient history when I came to the school, so I was just a jump ahead, I'm sure, of my classes while I was there.
What was Peking like in the 30s?
Well, it was a romantic city. I still look back, remember Peking as a walled city. There were walls enclosing the city. At that time, there were a population of about 1 million. That's at least quadrupled, I'm sure. It was a very romantic city. Camel caravans came down from western hills into the city carrying coal. I've seen pigs going down the street on rickshaws. And so it was a quaint, old Chinese city when I was there. And it's hard to believe some of the changes that have taken place in the last 10, 20 years.
And you revisited it in the 70s, didn't you?
1978, Jane and I went back and had a great reunion in China with the old school. We saw the old school.
But you couldn't get into it, I read in an article.
Right. We tried to persuade the woman who was in charge of the school that we'd come all this way primarily to see the school and also to visit Peking. she finally relented, let us in for about 3 minutes. So about all we saw of the school were the corridors. We later learned why we were not able to really get into the school. The communists had taken over the school as a place for its citizens. Some of the young Chinese who were in the Chinese Communist Party.
This was their meeting place?
This was a meeting place, and their executive offices were here. So it was understandable why they wouldn't permit us in.
No more camels, I'm sure.
No, not then.
Rickshaws?
No, but,
still rickshaws? Were there some rickshaws?
We saw some rickshaws driven automatically, not by manpower, but by machine power, and of course many bicycles.
And safe.
Thousands and thousands of bicycles.
You, I'm sure in the 30s you felt very safe, and in the 70s also, that feeling of leaving things and the honesty was still there?
Never had any question. Matter of fact, I didn't even in the 30s, although some missionaries in the hinterland were being murdered. I never felt, I left a dance one night from the Peking Hotel at 3 o'clock in the morning, walked at least a mile to my home without any feeling of fear at all. And of course I was a few years younger.
Okay, after you came back from Peking, I read in an article about you that you went into advertising. Then you had a fascinating 3-year stint with the FBI. I know you get asked that a lot, but for people who don't know about that in your background, tell me what you did.
Well, I was a special agent during the 3 years of the war, the 3 years that I was in the Bureau, and my role was a special agent. We were involved at the outset in selective service, checking and investigating selective service violations, all kinds of espionage, sabotage, anything connected with the war effort or with the enforcement of the many federal rules and regulations. So that we were kept busy. I was assigned 3 different offices while I was in the Bureau. First San Francisco, then Los Angeles, and then finally Cleveland. Well, you might be interested in one of the stories. I can tell you about one experience we had in the Los Angeles office. I think I can tell this publicly. One day we were called out in the Los Angeles Field Division by the director assigned to Santa Barbara to check the railroad stations to intercept a couple of Italian prisoners of war who had escaped from a prisoner of war camp. The reason we're told to check the railroad stations was that earlier a couple of prisoners of war had escaped and gone to Mexico via the railroad. So we checked for 2 days and 2 nights all of the railroad freight trains that came through that Santa Barbara station. Flashlights into the refrigerator cars, searching the hobo jungles with our revolvers ready at hand, just in case.
Sounds like a movie.
Well, it was rather exciting. But the upshot of the whole story is that after 2 days we got word from Los Angeles that the 2 escaped prisoners had turned themselves in. They'd taken some chocolate and some bread from the camp. We were only a mile away, and had turned themselves in, so all that effort was down the drain.
Another thing you were involved in was with the Japanese Americans after the war. Is that correct?
Well, when the Japanese were interned in prisoner of war camps, one of my responsibilities in the Los Angeles Field Division was returning materials that had been taken by the police and the sheriff's office to these Japanese. So I felt that perhaps at least in one way we were helping the Japanese at least recover those things that had been taken from them.
I mean pictures, documents?
Pictures, documents, all kinds of memorabilia. And of course the climate then was so different in the late 40s than it is now, and the early 40s. So that it's hard to imagine what, at least in the West Coast, the
what was
feeling
happening
toward
there.
The Orientals was, unfortunately.
And then you left the FBI. What made you come back? I mean, what made you go into education and dealing with students, and what brought you to Iowa City?
Well, I'd always had admiration for a dean of men at Ohio Wesleyan, who, because of the way in which he handled my involvement in a situation, I was called, in my last year at school, I had the nickname Flit because I used to go from one place to another in the library and take
Flit?
Flit.
F-L-I-T?
Flit.
Uh-huh.
Take up people's time, and I was so impressed by the way the dean handled my situation, I decided, well, then and there I wanted to go into deaning. And that was the beginning. Through my brother-in-law, I learned of an opening here in Iowa City at the university, interviewed C. Woody Thompson, who was then the dean of students, and was on board within a month after that as the assistant director and later counselor to men.
So this dean of back at Ohio Wesleyan, would you say he had a major influence on you in your life?
Well, certainly one. And then I had a brother-in-law who was had a great influence on me. He was an attorney and a professor of law at Ohio State. And his interest in defending the rights of the poor and the downtrodden always had an influence on me.
You were here taking another degree in the student affairs, then you became counselor to men,
Right.
and then dean of students.
students.
And you were in the 50s, and the 60s, and the 70s.
Right.
Can you capsule each decade a little, what kind of, as you recollect some of the high points of students and...
Well, in the 50s were, I would say, an age of it was a quiet period in terms of students. There were very little in the way of demonstrations. We had a panty raid in 1953, which was
shocked the campus?
well, one of the big ones in the country in 1953. Then the 60s, of course, then there was the beginning of a student revolt, excuse me, about everything. Rules and regulations. I recall, for example, a concern about how far a door in a dormitory room could be left open when the other sex visited. Could it be left open 12 inches, 20 inches? And this was one of the debates that went on in terms of rules and regulations during the 60s. But there was a great demand on the part of students for greater independence. The old idea of in loco parentis, the idea that the university was the parent of the student, became a little obsolete, or gradually became obsolete, and of course is now quite obsolete. Then in the 70s, the late 60s, of course, we saw the very real anti-war demonstrations, civil rights demonstrations, and these always kept me so busy that I never knew from one minute to the next what the telephone would bring.
And you weathered all of that. That's quite
Well,
remarkable.
That was, I would say, the only great achievement that I stayed on as dean of students, even though.
And then the 70s, how do you categorize the students in the 70s? Could you? I mean, can you categorize them, or is...
Well, in the early 70s, of course, the demonstrations were still going on. Some of the worst ones were in 70 and 71. And in connection with one of those, I'd tell you a story which always, I've always treasured because it was so much of a surprise. One of our radical leaders, whose name I'm sure is a public one, Jerry Size, was leading a group of about 20 or 30 students toward the old Capitol with a desire of taking over the president's office. And Jerry, I happened to run into them just by chance at noon one day, and Jerry was about ready to climb onto the balustrade near the president's office, and he got up to the top, was ready to get into the window, and I said, "Jerry, you come on down here." And I was never so surprised in my life. He came down. We got into a conversation along with the other students that he brought with him, and very soon a crowd came, before under the steps of Old Capitol. This was a demonstration against increase in tuition. Is that familiar to you?
Yes.
And I'll never forget, this was my birthday. There were police and security officers inside Old Capitol waiting for whatever happened to happen. And I kept the students at bay for at least 2 or 3 hours on the steps of Old Capitol. And for the first time, for one of the first times in my life, I received some credit from the editor of the Daily Iowa, which was rare.
You were usually lambasted by the Daily Iowa?
I was usually lambasted. As a matter of fact, one week I was designated Fink of the Week because we were not releasing, we were putting into student records of their student activities, which we'd hoped to use on students' behalf for purposes of reference. And,
sure.
we got all kinds of criticism because of this. And the editor of the Iowan, who since has become well-known in the Des Moines Register, called me the Fink of the Week. I was one of several who occupied that post in successive weeks.
I think you were in a period of a no-win situation as an authority figure, don't you think?
Well, there was no question, and I tell you had to have a sense of humor.
Which I hear you do, and you do.
In order to survive,
yes.
You had to have it. And you had to love students. I think those were two essential ingredients of working with students.
And obviously, you must be a very good listener. I mean, for 30-some years, you've had to listen to a lot of problems, haven't you?
My wife might have some question about how good a listener I am. I do my best.
You do your best. What are, besides the revolt of the 60s and the early 70s, what were some of the problems that you dealt with students for all these years? Do you have any, are there any typical problems? I mean, were these kids who, I mean, did you have to find places for them to go to think about future jobs? Were there kids who were getting pregnant and you were having to counsel them to?
Well, you know, we were talking about the rape crisis line. I had a number of women students coming in charging rape against their boyfriends, and this was you know, in those days, a very difficult thing to handle because the women never would go to the police because they knew what might happen in terms of how long it would take to get things resolved. So many times we worked with these situations. Well, it would be difficult to describe. I think if you name a problem...
That was it. They came to you.
Yeah, we would see it. And particularly when I was dean of students, I didn't do as much of this because I didn't have the time as an administrator. But the counselors in the office all were involved in this.
What did you learn from the students, Dean Huit?
Well, I think they were a better teacher to me than I was to them. I suspect one of the greatest things was the need to be natural in yourself. And if there's one change in students that I think I've seen over the years, it probably is the fact that students today are themselves. I don't think, try to hide anything. They're not superficial anyway. And I remember in those old days when students put on some kind of semblance of, you know, being a little better than the other person, or there was always that feeling of superficiality, which now just doesn't exist, which is a great thing.
Do you view the 60s, would you say that perhaps was your most challenging and favorite decade that you dealt with, or not? Well,
you know, I had no favorite. I suspect the 60s was the most challenging and exciting, but they were all wonderful years. And you know, for me, it was a labor of love. And as President Hampshire used to say, he had a love affair with this university. I think I've had a love affair with this university.
Do you think values have changed? Did you see values changing? You said that students seem to be more natural now and less airs are put on. Do you think the values are the same?
I think basic values have not changed a great deal. I certainly think that attitudes certainly have changed. For example, sexual mores have changed over the last 20 years without question. And I remember the days when I had to give a talk before the YWCA about sex on campus. I never forget that.
Oh, tell us about that.
Well, I was advocating, of course, no sex before marriage. And I would hear titters from the audience, you know, even then. Well, he's an old fogey who hasn't.
What year are we talking about?
Well, this would have been in the early 50s. But even then, things were beginning to change. And of course, after the Korean War and the return of the veterans and many things, Hugh Hefner's crusade, all of these things, I think had a lot to do with the change in the sexual attitude.
So how many administrations, I'm trying to figure, how many presidents were you under?
Well, let's see, President Hatcher for a number of years, and President Boyd, President Bowen, and his successor, President, whom I didn't serve under.
Friedman.
But I knew, of course, both Friedman and his successor.
Something very nice happened to you in 1978 when you retired from the university. A faculty award was established in your name, which I think is lovely, and I just would like to read what it says about this award. The Marion L. Huit Faculty Award was established in 1978 to recognize M.L. Hewitt's outstanding dedication and service to students of the University of Iowa during his tenure as Dean of Students. The award is presented annually to a faculty member who best characterizes Hewitt's contributions to the university and community life. Dean Hewitt exemplified the qualities of dedication to, concern for, and interaction with students. That's a lovely, lovely award. I don't mean to embarrass you. And so the first award started out with a Samuel Patterson in '79, and then you just mentioned before the interview that the 1990 award was just named this week, and it is
Dr. Gurnett in the physics department, who has been doing so much with space physics.
Looking back over your varied years of 4 different types of careers, and your being in Iowa City since the late 40s, what contribution or contributions are you the most pleased about to the university or to Iowa City?
Well, I would say I tried when I was Dean of Students at the university to make the university a more human kind of place where there was interaction between faculty and students. That was my certainly #1 goal. In the community, I would say most recently my involvement with civic, and I helped to found civic about 5 years ago, was probably the one thing in terms of community involvement I certainly feel a little happy about.
Tell people about civic. That's a really interesting and a very important part of our community.
Well, I suspect as part of my China experience, I've always had a very real interest in international understanding and the development of international understanding in the community. And this opportunity to develop and create an organization which might further this aim was pleasantly received when it was offered to me by Steve Aram in the Office of International Education. I grabbed at the chance, and with his help and others, helped to get civic started. And we're now a going organization, and we're having at least 60, 70, and 80 international visitors coming to Iowa City every year, referred by the State Department. And it's a wonderful opportunity for our own citizens to interact with foreigners from all over the world. And Iowa City is a wonderful place for this kind of interaction, as you know.
Yes. Tell us about the interaction. What does civic do? It's called the Council of International Visitors to Iowa City. So some people come in from China, say. Then what does civic do?
The local chapter, which is one of over 100, programs the visitor when he gets to Iowa City. They designate where they will have dinner, who will meet them at the airport. and arrange their whole program while they're here. These are short-term visitors, maybe 2 or 3 days at the most. And we now have an executive director, Tom Baldridge, and so I think things are going along very smoothly.
And the community has an opportunity to have these people in their homes for meals and sharing.
Right, that's certainly
conversation and
one of the
food.
very real advantages of this is that they have this opportunity, and for parents who have children, it's a great and unique opportunity for their kids to learn a little bit about the ways of foreign cultures.
You retired in '78, but it doesn't sound like you're retired. What are some of your hobbies that are keeping you so busy besides your involvement in Foreign Relations Council and civic?
Well, I have about an acre behind my house that I've turned into a golf course, so I do a little golfing on this. It's primarily a chipping course with only 5 holes, but I've converted it to an 18-hole course, and it's a lot of fun getting out there. We don't get onto large courses as much as we should because of this. This is one of the things that keeps me busy during the summer, taking care of the lawn. I love to do things outside, gardening.
You like to garden?
I'm an old bird watcher, and I happened to hear the speaker last night. Can't think of his name, who was talking about his experiences, and one of them was bird watching, and I asked him why he didn't say anything about bird watching, but a lot about all of his activities with sports. Then I enjoy still meeting with students and attending ODK mortarboard events, initiations, and going to lectures and musical concerts.
It's a wonderful place to live, isn't it?
It's a wonderful place to live, and there's no place like Iowa City.
My last comment is, I found out before the interview, was that you and your wife, Jane, are about ready to celebrate a 50th wedding anniversary.
Right.
Now that's remarkable also. How are you going to celebrate?
Well, we're going to have, I think, a fairly private family celebration at home, and we have a football game lined up for all the family the day before. So it'll be a gala weekend, we hope. Congratulations
on that, and also on a remarkable career, Dean Huit.
Well, thank you very much.
My guest has been M.L. Huit, better known as Huey or Dean Huit. He was Counselor to Men and Dean of Students at the university for 32 years. He was a friend to and a counselor for multiple generations of college young men and women. His careers have ranged from teaching in China to business advertising, FBI work, and of course dealing with university students. He dealt with the administration, the faculty, and students in an attempt to humanize this public institution. Besides his work at the university, Dean Huit contributed and continues to contribute his time and talents to various civic organizations. Iowa City and the university are indeed fortunate that Marion L. Huit made this community his home.